You ready?
Lose the light? Yeah. Can we lose the lights at all?
Yes, you can. Alright. Is that good? Or more?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, I guess we'll get going. This is then the fourth lecture on seduction and fake Gucci. I hadn't decided which title to give, and in the end, both titles were given. Just to briefly.
Excuse me, Neil. Why don't we, since there's so few, why don't we all move down here a little closer so we don't feel like there's an empty room?
Sure. Okay.
Help feel a little bit more sense of connection with you.
Yeah.
That'd be good.
Okay. So just in case anybody hasn't come before, this is really an attempt to rethink a book called The Anesthetics of Architecture, which came out 10 years ago. And the first lecture was about the danger of anesthesia, the danger of being intoxicated by images in a postmodern culture totally obsessed by a culture of images. And I was looking at particularly the work of Walter Benjamin on the way in which aesthetics could be anesthetic, that the images could literally have an effect of anesthetizing us from the kind of the real social and political issues that were behind architecture. That was chapter 3 of Anesthetics of Architecture, and the next lecture was about chapter 2, The Architect as Fascist, where I was looking in particular at this guy, Marco Casagrande, a very sensitive and well-respected designer from Finland, who nonetheless has had an interesting background as operating as a mercenary in a neo-fascist unit in the Serbo-Croatian War. And the question that I was asking, which came up in some respect out of the logic of anesthetics, is how could somebody as sensitive as that also be involved in something as abhorrent as a kind of neo-Nazi unit? And then the discussion really was about to what extent could we see architecture as somehow trapped within a kind of logic of the aestheticization of politics. And this is, of course, the image of Albert Speer's Cathedral of Light. The third lecture was about Guy Debord, chapter 4 of the Anesthetics of Architecture, where I was talking about his theory of the society of the spectacle, whereby in this postmodern culture we are so obsessed by a culture of images that we can't see ourselves except through the medium of images. And to that extent, according to Debord, we are alienated from our own selves. Reality has been lost behind a kind of culture, an obsession with images. And this clearly has a certain ramifications of the culture of LA, which is so kind of concerned with the culture of the image. Pamela Anderson, a culture of Barbie. Today I'm going to somehow do something to defend Pamela Anderson, defend Barbie culture. And I want to look at the anesthetics of the book on the right, but look at a book also on the left, Millennium Culture, which came out the same year, immediately after anesthetics, in which I began to sort of, I think, question some of the logic of Baudrillard. It is Baudrillardian in many ways, but then at some point it starts sort of questioning it and opening up in a new direction. It's a deliberately provocative book. It's about popular culture. I originally suggested I was going to write something about the Millennium Dome, the structure that was completed for the Millennium in the UK, in London. And my suggestion to the publishers, Ellipsis, was that I should talk about the Millennium Dome in the context of other aspects of Millennium culture, such as Diana, the Spice Girls, Jerry Springer, Barbie, Nike, and so on. And they said, well, actually, we're more interested in Diana, the Spice Girls, Nike, Jerry Springer, and Barbie, and I'm not so interested in the Millennium Dome, but please go ahead and write it. So I wrote this thing with a kind of shocking pink cover with false eyelashes on the outside, Che Guevara, Teletubby, and so on. The book sold incredibly well, but then Ellipsis somehow went bankrupt, so it's no longer on the market. But anyway, I want to pick up a bit on that. So it's a slightly sort of tongue-in-cheek lecture today, talking about popular culture in a slightly irreverent way, trying to defend, in some senses, it against the attack of Baudrillard, which, for all its kind of interesting insights, is somehow flawed. But I want to start off by talking a bit more about Baudrillard's thinking. Already I've mentioned him in context of discussion, first of all, of a culture of the ecstasy of communication, in Baudrillard's terms, a culture in which we are bombarded with information and images the whole time, 24 hours a day, all around the clock, to the point that we live in an information society in which there is so much information that there's no information. We live, in other words, in a culture in which there's this proliferation of images, all of which have been rinsed of meaning. It's been rinsed of meaning largely because we've lost touch with reality. And as I mentioned earlier, also Baudrillard was responsible for writing a book called The Perfect Crime. The perfect crime of the 20th century was the theft of reality. Someone has stolen reality. That led him to go and make these extremely provocative suggestions about, for example, the Gulf War not having taken place. And what Baudrillard really was doing was he had his term for his tactic was fatal strategy. The idea that what he was presenting was less a representation of reality than a transcendence of reality. And it was kind of like arguing something to an extreme degree in order to get his point across. So in some absurd way, I'm going to also adopt the fatal strategy today in arguing things to an extreme degree. I want to start off, though, with the idea of seduction. And Baudrillard famously wrote a book about seduction. Seduction here, it's important to note, is not about sexual seduction, although in our contemporary culture, seduction has been annexed as a part of the sexual. But what basically Baudrillard means by seduction is, there are two things basically one has to know about Baudrillard's comments about seduction. Firstly, it's a strategy that's emerged in contrast, in opposition to interpretation. Seduction is the only way we can operate today, according to Baudrillard. Seduction is about being trapped in a world of surfaces, being seduced by a world of surfaces, not inquiring beyond that layer of surfaces. In other words, it's not about interpretation, it's not about meaning. Meaning and interpretation are the opposite of seduction. Interpretation is about rupturing the realm of surface appearances in order to look beyond, in order to look for some underlying meaning. In our contemporary culture, there is no underlying meaning. There is nothing beyond. It is merely a question of seduction. Seduction has won over interpretation precisely because interpretation was so unseductive. And you can see this most clearly, I think, in the culture of advertising that we have today. A culture in which there's been a radical shift from, let's say, the first days of advertising. If you'd seen the early television advertisements from, I guess, around the 50s, I guess, you would often see examples of scientists coming on with a white kind of lab coat and giving you a kind of scientific explanation as to why a certain toothpaste or a certain washing powder was better than any other toothpaste or washing powder, and really arguing the case and giving you a kind of clear demonstration about the merits of a particular thing according to scientific principle. It was all about meaning and interpretation, and there was a kind of clear rationale behind the logic of the advertisement. Advertisements today, especially if you look at a journal like Wallpaper or Vogue magazine, are quite different. There is no text. There is no level of interpretation or meaning. What you get is basically some kind of dream-like model who is trying on a Versace coat or a Gucci coat or something. And all you'll get is maybe some reference to Hugo Boss here, in the case the designer of the outfits for the Third Reich, is some label. It's simply a question of kind of a dream world, a kind of space in which you kind of dream yourself into being that person wearing that suit. And it's a culture ultimately of seduction. Now, the other thing that Baudrillard says about seduction is that it should be contrasted to a world of production. Production is the culture in which we operate today, and seduction actually had its heyday in a kind of a world of the Middle Ages, a world of courtly love, a world of chivalry, of honor, of valor, in which seduction was used in a far more sort of subtle way. Seduction was about leading astray. It was about hiding oneself behind veils and gradually giving some hint about a possible world. By contrast, the world in which we live today was one of production, and production, in Baudrillard's terms, is simply a question of making things absolutely obvious, obscenely obvious. We live in a kind of culture, a discursive logic of the striptease in which everything has been made absolutely obvious, and the most extreme example of that would be something like pornography. There are no veils anymore. It's all been kind of opened up and exposed. And the subtleties of seduction as a kind of way of operating have been lost behind this kind of obscene, pornographic logic of the striptease that is our contemporary culture. And within that culture, seduction has lost its kind of strength. It's no longer this subtle social operation. It's something that's been co-opted by the world of the sexual and being used as a way of kind of oiling social relations, a kind of smooth semiurgy, a kind of a soft kind of world of seduction. So seduction basically has become the dominant way that we operate today, but it's a kind of seduction that has lost all its kind of potency, that's lost all its charm. Seduction basically in the age of production, in the age of a certain sort of capitalist machinery. So in some ways, this is an extension of what Debord was talking about, his comments about how in contemporary conditions of production, all that was once lived has become mere representation. For Baudrillard also, it is linked in some ways to capitalist production. And of course, architecture itself is ensnared within this kind of logic. Architecture itself has been kind of reduced in some ways to elegant forms. The discourse, the idea of kind of somehow having some level of interpretation has somehow been effaced. For Baudrillard, then, this is a sign of what he calls a culture of hyperreality. Baudrillard, as I mentioned, I think the previous time, was somebody who supported very strongly Debord's critique of 1960s society. At the time, he thought it was absolutely accurate. It portrayed very well a kind of culture that was somehow being submerged beneath a logic of advertising, of capitalist production. But the point is that actually things changed, things got worse. And according to Baudrillard, around the 1980s, late 80s, we entered into the third order of simulation, a condition in which the kind of prognosis of Debord had reached a kind of disastrous extreme, in which not only has somehow the reality been obscured in some way by an old world of images, but reality had been totally lost behind a world of images. We now lived in a world in which we were kind of marooned in a kind of hyperspace of reality, hyperspace in which we were we'd lost any reference in the world itself. So, and Baudrillard refers to this new world of images as a world of hyperreality. And he uses an architectural example to illustrate this point. He uses Disneyland, and his comment about Disneyland is that Disneyland presents itself as being a kind of imaginary kingdom that is set apart from the so-called real world outside. It's a kind of a space in which to escape, in which everything is somehow removed into a kind of world of the imaginary. But the point for Baudrillard is that actually that Disneyland is absolutely not removed from the world outside. It is a condensation, a kind of intensification in many ways of the values of America and by extension the values of the Western world. So its greatest deceit in some ways is to make us think or believe that the world outside is real. In fact, the world outside is hyperreal, and so it becomes, in Baudrillard's terms, a prop to reality. It makes us to believe that the real world is real. What's interesting in many ways about these comments is that if you take it to an extreme degree, what Baudrillard is saying is, or rather the corollary of what Baudrillard is saying, is not simply that the world outside is, or that Disneyland is no different to the world outside, but by extension, the world outside is no different to Disneyland. So, of course, people are very critical about Disneyfication as a kind of logic, and they would not want to see their architecture entrapped within the world of Disneyfication. But the point being that if we take the argument the other way around, everything has become Disneyfied, and the genius, as it were, of Disney was to recognize the mechanisms by which the world operates today. In other words, the logic of Disneyland, the logic of theming, and the logic of role-playing is all pervasive in our culture today. Just as when we go to Daniel Liebeskind's Jewish Museum in Berlin, we have to recognize that that is in some ways a theme park. So all of culture, by extension, has been locked into that sort of category of the theme park. It was, I think, for many people a kind of big surprise to see then the culture, the city, the country that had given us the chateau of Loire, the original authentic chateau of Loire, to see them adopting a fake American chateau. This is an image, obviously quite dated because the Concorde is, you can see Concorde at the top here. What is interesting about it in some way, and what I think somehow I found was outrageous at the time, was that Euro Disney was positioned here and somehow put on an equal par with Fontainebleau, Versailles, the Eiffel Tower, Arc de Triomphe, and Notre Dame, as though they were somehow the same, they were equal. But then I thought about it some more, and it struck me that absolutely that was exactly the case. They were equal. In other words, in a culture of Disneyfication, the Eiffel Tower, Notre Dame, Versailles, the Arc de Triomphe, Fontainebleau have essentially become theme parks. The question then is not so much whether or not Euro Disney is authentic or not, and I want to kind of revisit the question of authenticity, but whether we can even perceive that question of the authentic in a culture in which we operate today. So when, for example, we go for our weekend trip in our little 2CV car with a kind of French baguette sticking out of the roof, and we go and have a le picnic, and we're on for the Le Weekend visit to one of the chateaux, the question ultimately is whether we actually are really engaging with the ontological reality of whatever the chateaux were about. And to be honest, we probably don't want to know what the ontological reality of what the chateaux were about, because it was probably made out of money, out of the slave trade or something, but who knows. The issue ultimately, though, is not whether this is authentic or not, but whether we are engaging with the actual kind of historical reality of a place like this, or whether or not it's been somehow appropriated as part of a kind of commodified touristic experience that kind of puts it on the level, in other words, with Disneyland itself. So the question is ultimately, and of course this is the Eiffel Tower. Just in case you weren't aware it was the Eiffel Tower, it's got the label on it, the Eiffel Tower. And what you'll notice is this particular Eiffel Tower is somehow in a rather awkward relationship to another building beneath it, which it's straddling, and it's also seems to be half the scale of the actual Eiffel Tower. I'm sure everyone here will recognize this particular Eiffel Tower. Of course, it's not in Paris as such. It's Paris. It's the Hotel Casino in Las Vegas. And what's interesting, I think, about this particular structure, this particular theme park, shall we say. And I guess the whole of Las Vegas now, and just as a comment on last week, is not so much about the kind of Venturi, Scott Brown, and Eisenhower world of billboards, of neon lights and things. There is a kind of second generation Las Vegas, which is about the theming of cities. And just as Las Vegas itself themes cities, so I would claim the cities themselves have also been themed. They've all been co-opted, as it were, as theme parks. What's interesting about, if you go to this place, is that there's just outside the entrance, and I wish I'd taken a photograph of the guy when I saw him, but there's a guy, and he's there with a bicycle, and with a kind of a basket in front of the bicycle with some French baguettes in the bicycle, and he's got a berry on, and he's got a blue and white striped top, and he's got an accordion, and he's got a string of garlic, I think, around his neck or something, and he's playing the accordion. He's probably an immigrant Bulgarian who's been used for that, but the point is that we shouldn't scoff about that, because when we go to Paris itself, I think we're all looking for that particular character. If we went to Paris and discovered that all the Parisians were in fact drinking Dutch lager, driving around in Japanese cars, eating sushi, and wearing clothing from Gap clothing stores, we would be disappointed. We want to see that guy with his blue and white striped T-shirt and his beret on his bicycle with a string of garlic around his neck, to know that we're authentically in Paris itself. And of course, the reality of this is very different. It's all about ultimately the world inside, this kind of the gambling, and I guess the idea of somehow a theming of escapism, of making it into a kind of escapist kind of dream world, is all about feeding the possibility of the gambling itself. And conveniently, of course, when you're in Las Vegas, you haven't got to travel so far to get to Luxor. Not only is the climate in Paris a bit more acceptable than the climate in Paris itself, but without flying anywhere, you can get to Luxor, to New York, and to Venice, all in the space of a mile or so down the main drag. So the key question there, to my mind, is really not about how fake Las Vegas is, but rather how fake our engagement with the real world of Paris, New York, Luxor, and Venice. When I showed this to a colleague at the AA, she said, Venice. I didn't want to say, well, actually, the Car d'Oro and the Doge's Palace are a little further away in the actual Venice, but it is actually quite well done. And of course, the great god of contemporary architecture, Rem Koolhaas, has also been designed something for this particular hotel casino. And what is interesting about this place is that here you have to block out the fact there's a volcano or something on the other side of the road, and a number of other things happening around it, and try and pretend that actually this is not a swimming pool that this guy is the gondola is on, but actually it kind of smells of chlorine, which probably gives it all away. But pretend it's, and of course in Venice, the canals smell particularly awful particularly when there's at low tide and everything's exposed. But what's interesting, you go in there, and there's a sign saying upstairs Grand Canal, which is a bit disconcerting, because you have a sense that the water level was downstairs, and why is the Grand Canal upstairs? Then upstairs you do find this Grand Canal, which in many ways is pretty convincing, were it not for the fact that the ceiling forces the kind of the noise to be echoed in such a way as it's kind of clear that you're inside somewhere. Anyway, let's not scoff too much about this kind of world, because I think that the whole world of architecture is completely entrapped within this. Somewhere along the end of this Grand Canal, there's a sushi bar, which I might have mentioned before. At the time, maybe it's changed its name, but it was called Tsunami. I guess Tsunami is not quite such a kind of a palatable name anymore. And I went in there, and actually it's quite nicely designed. And I had some sushi, and I asked the owner. I said, "Who designed this?" And he told me it was Thomas Mann. and Thomas Mann was a German novelist from the 19th century, so I didn't think it was him. So I said, Thomas Mann? And he said, it's Thomas Mann from Morphosis. So, I mean, basically Morphosis, OMA, everybody's being kind of co-opted in this world. When you see this place, it's kind of interesting because you could almost imagine that you are in Venice. The curious thing is that these guys who are probably the gondolieri, who are probably actually from Detroit or something, have such a kind of masterful action of operating the gondolas. It's only later you realize that there's a foot pedal on the gondolas, and they are on some kind of track, and they're taken around. So it doesn't require so much skill to actually steer them. It's also a little disconcerting that the state of Nevada has insisted, and I think this is probably before that particular rule, but has insisted that everyone now wears safety belts. So, so I wanted to ask this question, though, in a way. So how different is it from the so-called real Venice? Venice itself, let's not forget, was actually it was an industrial port. That's how its wealth was generated, and that's how it was. That's the kind of its role, as it were. What it's managed to do, and there's an article in one of my books, The Hieroglyphics of Space, about Venice as a mask, is produce itself as the ultimate masquerade of itself. It has successfully reinvented itself as a city of tourism, as a city of the Biennale, as a city not of a kind of industrial, mercantile logic, but something that is quintessentially 21st century. And all the kind of trappings of that, the guys who are selling this kind of straw boaters or the masks for the carnival, or the kind of tacky little plastic gondolas with fairy lights on, and they're probably also from Bulgaria, I don't know. They're kind of feeding into this kind of logic of somewhere that ultimately probably doesn't have such a long history. And when you start inquiring a little further about aspects of Italian culture, such as this ancient traditional dessert that we've all tried called tiramisu, you suddenly find out that in fact I think tiramisu is having its 40th birthday this year. Tiramisu was invented in 1969. You begin to sort of realize that actually that maybe this world of the so-called authentic Venice is no longer quite as authentic as it might be. Ultimately, the question is not so much is to what difference is there ultimately between a place such as this and a place such as this. I actually gave this lecture 2 years ago when I was in. I was teaching at SAUC, and I was invited out to Rotterdam to give a lecture, and there was an exhibition of a curious exhibition. A German artist had an exhibition of a fake meteorite. It was very strange, and she had a meteorologist there, a scientist, who was talking about meteorites in a very scientific discourse, and I presented my theory of fakes, based largely on Venice. And it was a total contrast, this scientist and me and my theory of fakes. But curiously, the scientist actually really liked my theory. And it was kind of interesting when I went through some of the things that he had been saying about meteorites. Like he showed us a kind of bit of authentic meteorite from Mars and authentic meteorite from the moon. And I said, well, hold on a second, how do you get a bit of meteorite from the moon? And I mean, does the moon kind of emit meteorites? And he said, no. This is a kind of bit of the moon that's been chipped off by a meteorite that landing on the moon, and it's landed on the Earth. And I said, well, how do you know that? So I think at this point he was a bit uncomfortable because it wasn't so clear how you could prove that a bit of meteorite from the moon was actually from the moon. So anyway, and of course I was coming in from the other Venice, which you all know only too well, and this is the view from my window. So, okay. The question I want to ask then is to what extent is... It's a dolphin, okay. The question I want to ask then is really how can we in our contemporary world of hyperreality really talk about a culture of authenticity? And here I want to introduce something that the Slovenian psychoanalytic philosopher Slavoj Žižek introduced, which I think is a way, in some ways, of overturning some of the logic of what Baudrillard was talking about. If we follow Debord or Baudrillard through to their extreme degree, what they're arguing for is essentially there was a moment when we were in touch with reality, and now, because of our contemporary conditions, we have lost touch with that reality. There was a kind of golden age, a paradise, in which we were so-called directly in touch with reality. I mean, apart from the fact that seems totally utopian, you have to start asking the question, well, hold on, when was this moment of being in touch with reality? When was our engagement with the world not mediated through other kind of mechanisms, through class consciousness, through sexism and so on? When was this golden age in which we were kind of totally engaging with reality? Here I want to introduce the kind of the thinking of Lacan, just very briefly. Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalytic theorist who kind of continued and elaborated some of the ideas of Freud. And what Lacan says, and of course Baudrillard dismisses the ideas of Freud as being a very elaborate but rather meaningless structure. But what Lacan says basically is that we have to really question to what extent we are engaging with reality in the first place. He wrote something, or rather Slavoj Žižek wrote something kind of based on Lacan, which appeared in one of my early books, Designing for a Digital World. And what he basically says there, that according to Lacan, we never engage with the real in the first place. The real is something that we only ever access, in his terms, in moments of jouissance, this kind of bittersweet moment of aesthetic contemplation. What we take for the real is in fact the imaginary, and everything is filtered through the lens of fantasy, through the lens of our imagination. So Žižek has wrote this article, From Virtual Reality to the Virtualization of Reality, and in a sense it's the kind of same argument that I was making about hyperreality in a way, that if you look at the way in which the real has been virtualized in a culture of virtual reality, you begin to sort of realize that actually there was never any real in the first place, and what virtual reality reveals is not how virtual reality is, but rather how virtual reality itself is. This is a couple of quotes from Slavoj from that article. Far from being a kind of a fragment of our dreams that prevents us from seeing reality as it effectively is, fantasy is constitutive of what we call reality. We fantasize about everything. Everything comes to us through this kind of lens of fantasy. The most common bodily reality is constituted via a detour through the maze of the imagination. Everything is filtered through the maze of the imagination. So the ultimate lesson of virtual reality is the virtualization of the very true reality. What I then suggest in the context of people like sort of Baudrillard is that we need to somehow incorporate the notion of fantasy into this otherwise seemingly rather straightforward discourse. And in the book Millennium Culture, I look particularly at the work of Walter Benjamin, who had some amazing observations to make about the role of fantasy in the 20th century. There's a book by Graham Gillett called Myth and Metropolis, which lays out very clearly the way in which Benjamin's thinking about myth and mythologization and about fantasy related to our engagements with cities. And the point is simply this, is that we think that with the kind of the onset of modernity, with opening up in the 20th century, that we have entered into a world of rationality in which the other side of the so-called dialectic of the Enlightenment, myth, has been abandoned. We now moved into a highly rational, logical world, and myth and fantasy and magical thinking has been left behind. But the point being that Adorno makes as well is that actually these two worlds are totally dialectically connected, like the yin-yang. You can't have one without the other. So increasingly, just as the world of fantasy has become made more rational in a world of horoscopes where things are predicted in a very sort of logical way, so the world of rationality has been colonized by fantasy. Benjamin has a wonderful comment about this. I mean, he talks about how you go into a shop and you look at the things, and I guess this was in the 1920s and 30s, nothing like going into some of the kind of the kind of supermarkets in LA now, where you get kind of lobsters appearing from all over the world, and I don't know, wine from France and something. For Benjamin, the shop was this kind of magical kingdom because things were, as it were, conjured up as if from nowhere. They appeared on the shop shelves, but we didn't know how they got there. So the whole of kind of contemporary modern society was enshrouded by myth. It was totally mythologized. And for Benjamin, capitalism was really responsible for this. Capitalism had become, as he puts it here, this dream-filled sleep which came over Europe, and by extension, of course, the Western world, and through it there was a kind of reactivation of mythic forces. If you put this alongside Marx's comments about religion being the opium of the people, one can begin to see that what capitalism is ultimately a new opium, a new form of religion, a new way of thinking, a new mythologization of contemporary culture. In Millennium Culture, I talk about this further and how a hyper-technological world somehow, curiously, in a kind of odd way, invites the myth further on. So when you have a device like a cell phone, something so elegant, so slim, so highly technological, we don't know how it works. But somehow we know that it does work, we believe that it will work. And the logic ultimately is kind of similar to the logic of a magician. When a magician is performing magic, the magician does not perform magic. It's through a sleight of hand that the magician pulls out a rabbit from the hat or something. It's by concealing the actual operations that the audience is fooled into believing that the magician is performing magic. So it is with contemporary technological culture. We don't know quite how it works, but somehow we believe in it. Therefore, its status is somehow akin to the logic of magic. So it is when we go to the doctors. This kind of totally high-tech world of modern medicine. It's not so dissimilar. The way that we believe in the potential of the doctor's ability is not so dissimilar to the world in which the voodoo doctor would be operating in the past. This is, in some ways, fed by a culture of advertising, a culture of kind of total fantasy. When we see the way that advertising operates is that, interestingly, when you see an advert for a Porsche or Lamborghini or whatever it is, it's never actually shown in a kind of on the traffic clogged artery of the Route 10 or something or whatever it is. It's always on some kind of mountain pass up in the Grand Canyon, and normally they're playing Pavarotti. And the idea is somehow is not only that you dream about the possibility that you could be in that car, but then when you're in that car, when you actually buy the car, you still dream that you're driving through the Grand Canyon or something with kind of Pavarotti playing. So it is you might be stuck somewhere here. I don't know how this is taken because there's no such freeway in Sydney, but you are stuck in this traffic and actually you're dreaming that you are there somewhere up in the sky. So when Claudia Schiffer is climbing out of, what is this, of her Citroen, when you buy your Citroen, you are somehow dreaming that Claudia Schiffer herself would be sitting next to it when you're driving through LA. When you buy your Adidas outfit, the one that David Beckham wears, somehow you would assume that you are somehow able to play soccer, as well as David Beckham. When you buy your Prada handbag, somehow you perceive yourself as elegant as the model who is carrying the Prada handbag. So, in a sense, then, what we get is a kind of this contemporary millennium culture is a kind of fantasy culture that is fueled by these dreams, by these myths, a culture of, in a sense, of reinvention. This is an advertisement from Wallpaper. Who will you be in the next 24 hours? As though if you wear this watch, you could be someone else. So it's almost like identity itself is no longer singular. It's not as though we come from one particular village where we live all our lives and we marry the girl next door or the boy next door or something, and that's who we are. We now have a kind of plurality of identities. We are now able to reinvent ourselves. So identity becomes like some kind of fashion accessory. We have a kind of wardrobe of possible identities in which we can somehow reinvent ourselves. This idea of reinventing ourselves kind of goes back to the same things I was saying briefly last week about Judith Butler, the logic of performativity, how Judith Butler, who is this kind of feminist, she's a lesbian theorist, she teaches in Berkeley, and her argument is the fact that she has a female body does not mean that she has to be heterosexual. She can be who she was, and she can be who she was by performing in a certain way and giving her a certain identity through a logic of what she calls performativity. And that is how the whole of, in a sense, society operates. It operates through kind of modelling itself on a certain way and conforming to certain logics. And once you begin to realise that that's how gender has been operating, through a kind of logic of mimicry, of kind of masquerade, of drag, we are acting out, we always have been acting out our gender roles, you begin to realise that actually, if that's how it has been, then we can reinvent it. In other words, if traditions in society are based on simply instantiating something into some hegemonic custom through repeating a certain process, then if you make that process different, if you invent a different tradition, then things can be different. In other words, the logic of something like authenticity, there is some authentic way of doing things, is totally overturned by Judith Butler's thinking. There is no authentic way. It's simply the pattern in which things have been done in the past, and we can change that. We can make that different. So it is through kind of questions of kind of personal identity, we can change who we are by behaving in a kind of new way. It is, in other words, a kind of an emancipatory logic that kind of is kind of forward-looking and opens up the possibility of not being duped by a certain culture, but be able to reinvent ourselves. So I want to go back to Barbie. This is a little piece from Millennium Culture on Barbie culture. So maybe I'll just read it. This is a culture of depthlessness, where everything is judged on mere appearances like a book by its cover, both tragic and meaningless. It is a Barbie culture of fashion and good looks. In this world of Kodak camera, of Hello magazine, people become alienated from their true selves, so its detractors, i.e. Guy Debord, so its detractors claim, can only perceive themselves as though they are being captured on celluloid or featured on the glossy pages of some glamorous magazine. It is a world of beauty parlours, fashion catwalks, dyed hair and false eyelashes, a cosmetic world which conceals reality beneath a surface gloss. It is a world of appearances, fueled by the media, a commodified world of advertising, which sells you the latest fashion, but ultimately offers you little choice. For what marks contemporary fashion is not the desire for individuality, but for conformity. Follow the trend, keep pace with fashion. It is a world of Gap people in Gap clothing, Levi people in tight-fitting denim jeans, and Ralph Lauren would-be models lounging around in polo shirts, a universal no-place world of airport lounges and cosmopolitan cafes, at least according to Marc Auger. It is as though consumers have turned into animated mannequins, acting out their lives according to the well-rehearsed steps of some Hollywood role model. That's the kind of negative critique, right? From Debord, Baudrillard, Marc Auger, and so on. This Barbie culture is a fantasy culture, and Barbie sets the tone for this fantasy role-playing existence. Like Barbie, we can reinvent ourselves, selecting a new lifestyle as we might choose some new clothes from a mail-order catalogue. And like Barbie, we can remain in a timeless bubble, living out our lives as a fictive representation of ourselves, escaping from the world of the actual into dream world of the as-if. Through plastic surgery, we can remodel ourselves like some injection-moulded doll to meet our own aspirations. Stay young, stay beautiful. This is a Frankenstein world of mix and match, cut and paste technologies of the body, breast implants, nose jobs, liposuction, facelifts, and hair transplants. The Michael Jackson syndrome. Oh, he's a bit sad these days. Okay, moving on. Refurbished, extended, renewed. More than our homes, it is our bodies that are being continually renovated in a constant quest for the elixir of life, while life itself becomes an endless hedonistic replay of youth. Come on, Barbie, let's go party. And yet, is there not something positive in all this? This is where I kind of changed the whole book changes on this thing. Is there not something liberating? For consumers are never quite the passive dupes they're often portrayed as being. This is the kind of the argument in defence actually against Du Bois. Are we really taken in by this? Are people just as kind of these passive dupes? And Barbie can come to stand for the postmodern liberated woman, the ultimate embodiment of girl power. She is in charge of herself, in charge of her own destiny. She is empowered. Barbie can be anyone from fashion victim to President of the United States. This is the lesson of Barbie. And it's not just her body or profession that she can change. She can change her identity and even her sexuality. Heterosexual, bisexual, gay, change card, change identity. Plastic selves in plastic bodies. The possibilities are endless. Barbie culture. Life in plastic. It's fantastic. I guess, that was actually written having read Judith Butler, and it was a kind of total example of seduction, because I was not, although I didn't put any footnotes in saying, look, see Judith Butler, gender trouble or something, but it was trying to, I guess, enter into the logic of what that is. So we end up then, Gucci, this kind of world of the superficial, a world of a kind of escapism, a kind of dream space that is in some way fueled by capitalism itself, fueled by the logic in which we operate, which is not as kind of as enlightenment, rationality based as we would have it think. It's suffused by a kind of a culture of myth, of fantasy. It is dominated in a sense by a Disneyfied culture of role playing and theming. Everything is themed. When we go down the street in, Abbot Kinney Boulevard, are we going to have Japanese, or are we going to have Italian, are we going to have... It's the same kind of logic of going to Las Vegas. Are we going to go to Paris? Are we going to go to the Venetian, New York, or what have you? It's the same logic of actually going in a plane and going to Paris itself. The whole world, in many ways, has been kind of co-opted by this logic. So in other words, the question is ultimately not so much... how much we've been co-opted by this and how the world has become a theme park, but whether or not we could even entertain such concepts as authenticity that's so dominant in certain kind of architectural circles today. I'm going to finish off with a little piece that appears in in my book on China, which got banned in China. Somebody read it. One of every 798 they go on time zone, and somebody reads all the books and decides whether or not they're suitable for a Chinese market. And somebody didn't like mine, which is at least they read it. So this is something about fake Gucci. I was intrigued once when I was in Venice. It happened to be Venice, could be anywhere. And I walked past the Gucci shop and discovered a whole bunch of guys, Africans, I guess, selling fake Gucci. And it struck me at the time that probably the guys who work in the Gucci shop were outraged that that the guys were selling fake Gucci outside their shop. But according to the logic of this piece, which in some ways echoes the kind of logic of what Zizek was saying, I think they should be grateful, because I think the guys selling fake Gucci are actually kind of reinforcing the brand name Gucci. So I'm going to finish off with this this short piece on fake Gucci. Fake Gucci, the ultimate irony. What is real Gucci? For Gucci is not a product as such. It is simply a brand name, an epithet, a set of social values projected onto the object, a sanctioning device, an endorsement, a means, in short, of escalating the price of a product. But it's not as though customers resent this tactic. They enter into precisely the same logic. They are not interested in the product itself. They are only interested in the label, because by buying the product and displaying its label, they too are sanctioned by Gucci. They too become Gucci. Nor do they resent the extortionate price, because their purpose of buying it is to show precisely that they do not care about money. They are interested only in appearance, the appearance of conspicuous consumption, the paradox of luxury. While those without money desperately want enough to buy luxury goods such as Gucci, those with money want only to show they do not need it. Meanwhile, there's another category of customers, such as me, who would only want to buy fake Gucci. I love fake Gucci. Not for them the absurd squandering of wealth that it would take to buy real Gucci. No, they are not fools. But do they not enter into the same logic? Are they not, ironically or otherwise, playing the same game of endorsement and counter-endorsement? What an amazing marketing ploy. Take anything, label it Gucci, and what you have, Gucci. But the logic also works for fake Gucci. Take anything, label it fake Gucci, and what you have, fake Gucci. Of course, this is the important bit, okay? Of course, the two work in tandem. Without fake Gucci, there would be no real Gucci, and without real Gucci, there would be no fake Gucci. The purpose of fake Gucci, then, is to make you believe that real Gucci is real, and the purpose of real Gucci is to make you believe that fake Gucci is fake. Yet once the charade is revealed, the logic of authorization collapses under the weight of its own circular argumentation to reveal its opposite, the fakeness of the real and the reality of the fake. What fake Gucci reveals, then, is not how fake Gucci is, but rather how fake Gucci itself is. Likewise, what Gucci reveals is not how fake Gucci is, but rather how convincing fake Gucci is as a label. Just as Gucci is another fake on the marketplace, so fake Gucci is another label with its place on the market. I hope that wasn't too much. So anyway, you'd be able to see some kind of dominant kind of logic running through that. The logic that was the same for a kind of thinking about virtual reality, the way that Zizek was thinking about virtual reality. It's not as though virtual reality is so virtual. Our own reality is virtual. The lesson then of virtual reality is to make us realize that how virtual reality itself is. And the logic also of hyperreality, at least taken in a certain way, when you go to Las Vegas, or indeed when you go to Paris or you go to Venice, is to realize that actually what Las Vegas tells us is not how fake Las Vegas is, but rather how fake the world of Paris and the world of Venice itself is. This was a kind of, I guess, a rather kind of kitschy postmodern popular culture presentation. Next week's going to be a little more serious from a kind of philosophical viewpoint. I want to then talk about this book, which took a long time to write, and which is much more... actually, in a way, Millennium Culture is skating on the surface in a completely kind of contemporary seductive way because it's hiding its sources. And then I started to write Camouflage at the same time I was writing Millennium Culture, and the kind of logic of Judith Butler, the logic of Zizek, the logic of Khan is actually dealt with in some greater detail. But what I really want to kind of open up is next week is the way in which this world of images, which has been dismissed by so many, is actually vital in according to certain theoretical frameworks, especially to the kind of like within the logic of psychoanalytic theory. It is vital to our sense of who we are. In other words, the role of the image is the logic of the masquerade is fundamental to personal identity. The logic of branding, the logic of makeup is not about something that is maybe obscuring a reality. It is somehow helping to be constitutive of a certain sense of reality or a certain form of identity. So next week, I'm just going to give you, it's not going to be too theoretical, but I'm going to give you a sort of an overview of the way in which that is played out through this book, Camouflage. Okay, I guess we have some time for some questions, if anyone wants to ask questions. Yeah?
How do you, I mean, ending up at this point, how do you avoid a problem of just complete paralysis? I mean, if what you're saying is the question, the theme part, what the difference is between the Las Vegas and the real Venice, the original Venice.
Yeah.
My first kind of comment would be, well, what one difference is related to memory, history, and the reality of the materiality which accumulates over that time versus the immediately constructed version of that.
Yeah.
But once you've dismantled it the way that you have, where does that leave you in terms of being able to act and move forward?
I think, in many ways, it's not a very enabling discourse. I think that the logic ultimately is one of simply kind of revealing the problematic. In other words, I think I mentioned this before. Once you're aware of a problem as a problem, it becomes a problem by which you are not trapped, but by which you can deal with. So you're aware that it is an issue. So that's the starting point in some way. I mean, I think the kind of question is ultimately and I think I also maybe mentioned this. There was last year I was at an event, May '68 40th anniversary thing in Croatia, and there was a guy there, Karl-Heinz Delwo, who'd been one of the original Red Army faction, one of the deeply politicized, actually so-called terrorists who'd been operating in May '68. And he'd been in prison for 20 years because he'd been part of a failed occupation of the German embassy in Sweden, and two hostages got killed. And he came out, and he and his partner were very impressive people in a way. I mean, they still really held to what they believed in, and they were very intelligent about what they argued. They were remorseful about what happened, but they were saying, our aim is to keep the memory alive of what happened. Now, which is, of course, a noble enough aim, but the point ultimately is that who is to guarantee that's going to happen? The danger is that kind of figure, this kind of, extreme, passionately involved individual will be co-opted in a contemporary world in which of the sublime and become a kind of Che Guevara figure appearing on T-shirts all over the place. So the point ultimately is that there is no such thing. I mean, you have to be aware of that danger. It's not to say there isn't an original Venice, and there isn't a kind of recently reproduced Venice now, but it's about really trying to strip away the kind of way in which that has been co-opted within a particular kind of culture. So memories as such will always be kind of invaded by a kind of logic of the fantasy. They'll be conditioned by it in a certain kind of way. So I guess it's more a kind of warning sign to not talk about authenticity, to try and avoid a certain way of thinking that you're dealing with reality. Now, once Coca-Cola is presented as the real thing, what is reality? So it's more about just the kind of assumption, and it's the whole discourse as it appears in let's say Kenneth Frampton world of architecture about authenticity is a very moralizing one. I guess I was taught by Dalibor Vasley, who was kind of more extreme version of that, and there was an incredible kind of obsession, almost trying to counter the world of postmodern simulation via another more authentic understanding of the past. And you ended up feeling in the end that this kind of world, and Dalibor produced this wonderful book that's very seductive in a way, about a kind of rewriting of the history of architecture. And you soon began to realize that this kind of obsession with the historical that was around in the 1980s was really ultimately not a resistance to the world of the postmodern culture. It was almost a product of that culture. And it was not so different to the historical stage set kind of dramas you'd see on television, the kind of interest in history that existed then. And you can take this further as kind of dialectical process. The way that I think maybe I know I mentioned this before, but the way that Frederick Jameson has critiqued Kenneth Frampton's discourse of critical regionalism is to say that so you're trying to resist this world in which everything is being co-opted into images and commodities, but actually, you're trying to resist the kind of the globalizing placelessness of contemporary late capitalist culture. But all you're offering, ultimately, is another product on the marketplace of contemporary late capitalist culture. Difference becomes another marketable item. Therefore, in the end, regionalism is somehow simply a product of postmodernism. In some way, it's actually kind of like feeding it. Right. So the universal feeds the regional in a kind of dialectical way, and the regional feeds the universal. So you don't stand outside of it. You're entrapped within that kind of culture. So I think it's by taking a kind of a line that is kind of like going beneath the surface, and although at first value there is a kind of something that seems to be convincing about a discourse, let's say, of authenticity or regionalism, all those kind of things that Frampton himself would talk about. Once you look beneath the surface, there is, I think, another logic at work that kind of reveals itself as co-opted by its opposite, in the same way as I would claim that anti-capitalists are somehow caught up in capitalism. Anti-capitalism is a kind of lifestyle choice in a kind of capitalist world.
So is there any strategy that really enables an actual break, or is it inevitably just another layer of co-optation within the same system? Are you always in this dialectic relationship to the system that you've already, in a sense, having been co-opted by, having recognized that, inevitably still you're immediately drawn back into that same relationship, just with a with another point, another perspective, but just like what you just said, the capitalist, anti-capitalist.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't it really just that same dialectic, just at yet another level? Or is there a strategy to really break from that and really attack it from another way, a completely different?
Well, next week I want to say something about that, about, I mean, another way of operating, which comes out of Frederick Jameson's work. So maybe I'll keep that for next week. But no, but I think if you start looking at a lot of contemporary culture, I mean, like I don't know if you've seen the book by Naomi Klein, No Logo. You know, if you look at the book No Logo, it's got a logo in it somewhere, right? Or there's the kind of the shop that you probably get over here. You certainly get in London a lot, Muji, which is a no brand name shop. And what's recognisable about goods from Muji, they haven't got a brand name. So it's a no brand name. So it kind of there's a logic that runs throughout these things, which at least you want to kind of like highlight in some way. I mean, I want to argue next week that there is something about design that can maybe take us out of that trap. But it's a kind of, I mean, of course, and I'm not saying that black is white and white is black, but more that we should be aware that things are a little more dialectical than they've been presented. That, you know, in the dialectic of the Enlightenment, as Adorno would say, where there's Enlightenment thinking and there's kind of mythological thinking, let's not think that we left one behind, because one brings the other with it. You know, in the kind of the world of the computer screen, you get the goblins and gremlins of a kind of a different kind of mythological world that come with it. So it's really kind of about dialectical thinking and being aware of that. Yeah.
And this may be following up on Mark too, but is there a place for that dialectic to go away? You may be holding that for next week as well, but I mean, is there a place for the real Venice and the fake Venice to coincide? Is there a place that's sort of half fake and half real?
I guess you have to dispense the word fake and dispense the word real. I think, I don't know.
I mean, one way I always think of Las Vegas is not exactly as fake, because it's a provocative word.
Yeah.
And it's in many ways more make-believe than fake.
Yeah.
And that kind of making-believe is something that all these kind of simulacral effects.
Yeah. I think what I was just going to say is that once you take up the concept of the masquerade, everything is masqueraded. Therefore, it's not so much about fake versus real, but understanding that the play is something more subtle than that, and that those terms are too simplistic and too moralizing, I would say. I
think maybe another comment. How would you, if you create a society in which you create leisure time? Now, if all of your time is devoted to surviving, you know, working enough to gather enough food, enough place to survive, and that's really what you do. And there are a few people in that culture that are the overlords that gain the benefit. But if the mass of society creates enough excess production to be able to have leisure time, then what do you fill that time with? And is that part of what opens up this divide between the real and the fake?
Yeah. No, I guess, I mean, the danger of Baudrillard's discourse is that it's too overarching. It assumes that everybody's in the same condition, but maybe the guy working in the field in Africa or something is not co-opted in the same way as the guy in front of a TV screen in LA is. And equally, maybe in terms of my discourse also, there are other people who are working in a certain sort of way who are not so co-opted into that sort of that trap as such.
Yeah. It's a lot to take in.
It's interesting. I was thinking of that saying is an advertising slogan for Las Vegas that maybe for everyone in the room probably has. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And I was thinking of Venice, Italy, and so there was during Carnivale, which is really just giant city masquerade ball. The thing that's very kind of interesting about it for people, I think, is the notion of dressing up in character and anonymity, and the kind of freeing aspects of that, right? One can be something else. And, of course, that's been going on for a fairly long time as well. And so I guess the question, I guess, for me is in my head, and you can help me. But it seems to me you bracket the discussion as a kind of postmodern condition. And that sometimes as you're describing it, I'm thinking, well, now that we've lived with these kind of projects, let's say, Disneyland, but there's many, many, many others, and kind of fallout, architectural fallout of those projects, that of course they begin to merge, which is seemingly your argument, that one reality is another version of it, and that actually they coexist, the Gucci, fake Gucci argument? Or is it a condition that's just existed that is not actually a result of, let's say, the last 50 years, but it's in fact something that's just been ongoing and ongoing? This would be my question.
Well, I think, the Baudrillard's argument about that, if you sort of say, well, okay, it's a question of dress, right? Okay, maybe there have been sort of there still are certain cultures in which certain, like, national dresses are worn on certain days, so that they go back, and so dress or dressing up itself does have a kind of long history. And Baudrillard's comment is actually we've reached an extreme degree in this culture of hyperreality where it's been used in a certain kind of way. And I think the question ultimately is not to look at the most extreme situation of, say, the Carnival in Venice, but to look at maybe the reality of, say, life as an architect. The fact that we dress up in black or whatever we dress up in, and you then sort of realize that actually there are certain, so when you look at the individual and the way in which a certain individual might have a plurality of identities, be an architect, be a teacher, be a father, a lover, a secret lover, or whatever it is, as the son, and we all kind of take on those multiple identities today. And not only that, but we also take on a kind of multiple sense of where we come from. Somebody, for example, who maybe, like Ravi, comes from Thailand and then from Berkeley comes here, where does she come from? And I think the point is ultimately we worked out a way of operating with a kind of multiplicity of different backgrounds, and we kind of play one off against the other. So is there a real Ravi? Where is the real Ravi? And in some ways, who is James Bond, for example? Or an actor would be an interesting person to ask. If you saw some of the guys who've played James Bond, and you've got Sean Connery, to what extent, who is Sean Connery? Actors are kind of interesting people because they don't really have an identity, I don't know many, but people say they're kind of boring to talk to because they simply kind of take on this identity, and I think that logic of acting, of the performative, has increasingly kind of pervaded our society. Not clearly here you've got an actor who's your governor here, but I think to what extent we are all acting something out. We are all in drag. We are all playing out something according to a logic that we've been told by our peers, by our parents, by our teachers, is the way that we should behave. That would be the logic of Judith Butler, which I think is a very interesting logic, because then you begin to realize it's kind of nothing has an authenticity about it. It's simply been instantiated to become hegemonic by the fact that people keep on doing the same kind of thing over and over again, and that's how something exists. So what I'm trying to do is not to question whether there is a kind of real person as such, but rather question the kind of the way that the moralizing kind of like veil of the authentic has been introduced into our contemporary discourse, and especially into our contemporary discourse of architecture. What is authentic to one year? To our grandparents, plastic chairs were inauthentic, but they become very much kind of part of the logic of how we operate today.
Which actually, I wanted to say this for a little while now. Which brings up this whole question of questioning our profession in terms of the authenticity of our design versus the authenticity of a developer going out and creating Disney World. Whether or not it starts to question the whole notion of style, and style in response and in a dialectic with each other in respect to, well, what makes Rem's brand versus Tom Main's brand better than the other, and what makes Tom Main's brand better than what Joe Schmo designed for as a style in order to address his client's needs to create a fantasy land, which starts to, do you see what I'm saying? It's the way I'm starting to think it's like, it's like survival. It boils down to the fact that it's really about us acknowledging ourselves in whatever identity gives us the power in which to have more money or more control or whatever we want to over somebody else. I think it's ultimately about a search for identity. I'm always interested in architecture in terms of identity. And I am an actor, remember that. So I truly explored that knowing that this was a part of who I was as an artist.
So,
getting down to it, it ultimately makes our profession want to question whether or not what we position to our students and to the rest of the world as authentic architecture, is that really as authentic as somebody who's not trained to be the way we are?
Okay, first of all, I think one of the problems of Baudrillard, and the problems are also in a sense of just extrapolating an argument that is in opposition to Baudrillard, is that he doesn't differentiate between good and bad images. It's just like the world of images is bad. I think Benjamin, and maybe the problem of anesthetic was trying to collapse Benjamin's project into Baudrillard's. Benjamin believes in the capacity of an image to do certain things. So the surrealist image would shake you into, it was deliberately shocking in its kind of juxtaposition of things, would shake you into thinking in a certain sort of way. So there's a power potentially in an image, and I think particularly out of the way it's designed as such, that should be used to differentiate one image from another. But having said that, maybe there are some things in Disneyland that are actually better designed than things that aren't in Disneyland. But yeah, but I think the message here is not so much whether it's good or bad design, but to see that we're all, that logic of role playing and theming is the genius of Disney is to recognise that, and we are all in some way caught up with that, and we have to understand that and find a productive way of operating within that thing. Now, so there can be good and bad design, but that's another issue, I guess, in some way. Yeah, but you'll be a great person to play the role of the architect. We're all playing the role of the architect. That's the point of it. Yeah. So. Anyway, I don't want to be seen to be too kind of ephemeral by jumping between different discourses, from deeply political ones to superficial kind of Barbie culture ones. But
really, I know a lot of us got this in school, and the students, you guys are getting it from me for the first time, but I loved this stuff. I just totally loved it.